I am therefore puzzled by the fact that neither the unclassified nor the classified threat assessment makes any reference to risk or danger associated with foreigners voting in our elections. Director Patel, how many non-citizens have been convicted of voting in U.S. elections in the last 10 years?
The conviction stats are with the Department of Justice. I defer to them on that.
You are the director of the FBI. Give me a guess. How many convictions in the last 1 year, 5 year, or 10 years? Ballpark.
I don't have that with me, sir. Again, it's with the department.
You don't have that. Okay. Director Patel, how many active investigations does the FBI have into foreign individuals voting in U.S. elections?
We have a number of investigations, generally speaking, ongoing about individuals across the country.
Yeah, I'm asking for that number.
I don't have that number with me, but I have a number of them.
You have a number of investigations. Okay, is that number 10,000? Is it closer to 10,000 or closer to 10?
It's probably somewhere in between.
Okay. Will you please provide the committee with that number?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Director Patel, since you don't have the numbers, would it surprise you to know that the Heritage Foundation, which is not exactly the Columbia University Faculty Lounge, found only 77 instances of non-citizen voting in the 24 years between 1999 and 2023, each of which faced investigation by the appropriate authorities. So Heritage has a number of 77 examples in 24 years. Does that number surprise you?
No, because it's low.
I don't understand your answer.
You asked me if I was.
Are you disputing that the number is in the range of 77 examples of non-U.S. citizens voting in U.S. elections in a 24-year period?
I just said that number is low.
You think that number is low? Okay. So why, if this is a meaningful issue, do we have no, and I guess I direct this to Director Gabbard, why is there no mention of this thing that will grind the American government to a halt for a 2-week period in the worldwide threats analysis?
We just watched the fireworks, but now it's time to look at the fuse. Let's break down exactly how they set this up. March, Washington, D. Inside a formal House Intelligence Committee hearing, under oath, in front of cameras that archive every hesitation, Congressman Jim Himes asked a question that should have had a one-word answer. Instead, it produced silence disguised as speech. Tulsi Gabbard, Director of National Intelligence, was asked 3 times whether there was any credible foreign interference in Georgia's 2020 election. 3 times she avoided saying yes. 3 times she avoided saying no. At that same table, FBI Director Kash Patel could not even estimate how many non-citizens had been convicted of illegal voting, while the United States Senate prepared to halt legislative business for 2 full weeks over that exact threat. And when the number finally entered the room, it didn't come from the FBI, it didn't come from the DOJ, it came from the Heritage Foundation. 77 cases in 24 years. So here is the question. Are we looking at a national emergency, or are we watching one being constructed in real time? This is not a normal hearing. This is not a routine oversight exchange where prepared statements get filed and forgotten. This is a stress test of something much more fragile, the relationship between power and proof. Because what unfolded in that room was not a revelation in the traditional sense. There was no single document dropped on the table, no whistleblower, no smoking gun. What Jim Himes exposed was quieter, but more dangerous, the gap between what is being claimed and what can actually be shown. He began with Georgia. Not theory, not speculation. A specific place, a specific election, a specific allegation that has circulated for years. Was there credible intelligence of foreign interference in the 2020 Georgia election? That is not a complicated question. It does not require a speech. It requires information. Gabbard's first answer moved away from the timeline, away from Georgia, into a general statement about ongoing foreign efforts across multiple elections. Himes cut in. He didn't let the answer drift. He pulled it back to the point. Georgia, 2020. Intelligence. Yes or no? Her second answer did the same thing. motion without direction, words that sounded active, continuing to look, ongoing threats, but delivered no destination. By the third attempt, the pattern was undeniable. This was not uncertainty. This was avoidance. And when Himes asked if he should assume the answer was no, Gabbard did not correct him. She repeated the process, continued to look, continued to assess, continued, without ever arriving. And here is where the hearing shifts. Because what was not said becomes more important than what was. No named foreign actor. No cited intelligence report. No reference to a classified finding that could not be disclosed. Just an absence, wrapped in procedural language. And in that absence, something becomes clear without ever being stated. There is no specific, credible intelligence tying foreign interference to Georgia's 2020 election that she is willing, or able, to present. Then Himes moves, not away from the issue, but deeper into it. From Georgia to Puerto Rico, from unanswered questions to unexplained actions. The Office of the Director of National Intelligence had taken custody of voting machines from a U.S. territory, not hypothetically, not in a report, physically taken, stored in a secure federal facility. That is not routine. That is not standard procedure. And when asked whether Congress had been properly notified, Gabbard's answer was simple. She did not believe they had. Let that sit for a moment. A federal intelligence agency takes control of voting machines from a U.S. territory. The Oversight Committee is not clearly informed, and when pressed for the justification, there is no named foreign adversary, no confirmed breach, just vulnerabilities, possibilities, things that could have happened, might have happened, could potentially be exploited. This is where the pattern begins to form. Not evidence leading to action, but action searching for evidence. Not a defined threat, but a space where a threat could be imagined. And as Himes pivots again, from machines to legislation, from intelligence to politics, the scale of that pattern becomes impossible to ignore. And that's where the hearing stops being about answers and starts becoming about consequences. Because outside that room, while these non-answers were stacking up, the United States Senate was preparing to do something extraordinary. Shut down meaningful legislative work for 2 full weeks. Not over a war, not over an economic collapse, over a bill called the SAVE Act, framed as a necessary response to an existential threat, foreign nationals voting in U.S. elections. Now pause on that word, existential. That is not a casual label. That is the kind of word you use when something threatens to break the system entirely, when normal rules no longer apply, when everything else must stop. So Jim Himes does something deceptively simple. He doesn't argue. He doesn't speculate. He goes to the documents that are supposed to define reality, the threat assessments produced by the intelligence community itself. Unclassified, classified, annual, comprehensive, the official record of what actually threatens the United States. And he looks for it. Not a mention, not one line, not a category, not even a footnote acknowledging foreign nationals voting as a meaningful threat. The very issue being used to justify halting the Senate does not appear in the documents designed to identify existential risks. That's not a political argument. That's a factual gap. And gaps like that don't just exist quietly. They demand explanation. So Himes turns to Kash Patel, Director of the FBI, the man responsible for enforcing federal law, investigating election crimes, allocating resources, directing agents across the country. If there is a real, measurable threat of non-citizen voting, his agency would know. Not in theory, in cases, in numbers, in arrests, In convictions, Himes asks the question directly. How many non-citizens have been convicted of voting illegally in U.S. elections over the past 10 years? Patel deflects, says the numbers are with the Department of Justice. He would defer. Himes doesn't accept that. Because this isn't a technical question. This is the central premise behind a national legislative freeze. So he narrows it. 1 year, 5 years, 10 years. Give me a ballpark, a range, a sense of scale, and Patel has nothing. No estimate, no approximation, not even a guess. Let's stop there again, because this is where the hearing crosses a line from uncomfortable to revealing. The FBI director came prepared for this hearing. His staff came prepared. The issue of non-citizen voting was not obscure. It was dominating the political narrative at that moment. It was the justification for the SAVE Act. It was the reason Senate business was being suspended. And the man in charge of enforcing the law tied to that issue could not tell you how often that law had actually been broken. So Himes brings in a number, not from a partisan opponent, not from a critic. From the Heritage Foundation, a conservative institution with every incentive to document as many cases as possible. Their finding, 77 instances of non-citizen voting between 1999 and 2023, 77, across 24 years, across hundreds of millions of voters, across dozens of federal election cycles, each one investigated, each one processed. That's not a wave. That's not a pattern. That's not an existential threat. That's a number you could write on a single sheet of paper. Himes asks Patel if that number surprises him, and Patel says no, because it's low. Think about that response carefully. Not, that sounds accurate. Not, that confirms what we've seen. Not even, that's within range. He says it's low, which implies the real number is higher. But he cannot say how much higher. He cannot provide the data. He cannot point to the cases. He cannot even give a rough estimate. So what we are left with is this: a threat described as system-breaking, supported by a number that barely registers at scale, acknowledged by the FBI director as incomplete, but without any evidence to expand it. And this is where the pressure begins to build. Because now we are no longer dealing with uncertainty. We are dealing with contradiction. A Senate halted over a threat that intelligence reports don't list. An FBI director who cannot quantify it. A number that exists, but doesn't match the scale being claimed. And the question starts to sharpen. If the evidence is this small, why is the reaction this large? And this is where the hearing stops being about numbers and starts being about narrative control. Because when the scale of a threat cannot be demonstrated, the only way to sustain it is to shift the conversation away from evidence and into abstraction. That is exactly what you see when Jim Himes circles back to Tulsi Gabbard one final time. If this is real, if this is significant enough to freeze the United States Senate, then why does it not appear in the official threat assessments? Not hidden, not classified beyond reach, just absent. Gabbard's answer is procedural. She explains how the annual threat assessment is structured, how priorities are determined, how different platforms exist for reporting different categories of threats. It sounds complete. It sounds technical. It sounds like an answer. But listen carefully. It never actually addresses the question. It never says the threat exists. It never says here is the intelligence. It never says here is the scale. This is what a non-answer looks like at the highest level. Not silence. Structure. Language that explains process instead of substance. Because process is safe. Process cannot be disproven. But process also cannot justify shutting down a government. And now the pattern is complete. Georgia. No specific foreign interference identified. Puerto Rico. Voting machines seized without a named foreign threat. Threat assessments. No mention of non-citizen voting as a major risk. FBI Director. No numbers to support the scale of the claim. Heritage Foundation. 77 cases in 24 years. Every piece points in the same direction, not toward confirmation, toward absence. And this is where the logic tightens, because an existential threat requires three things: scale, evidence, and urgency. Take away any one of those, and the claim weakens. Take away all three, and the claim collapses under its own weight. Here, the scale is minimal, the evidence is undefined, and the urgency is being manufactured externally, through political action, not intelligence findings. So what replaces evidence when evidence is not available? Language. Words like could, might, potentially, ongoing, continuing to assess. These are not lies. That's what makes them effective. They are technically true, but they are also technically empty. They describe a space where something could exist without ever proving that it does. And when repeated often enough, they create the impression of movement, of activity, of vigilance, without ever delivering a result. Now bring that back to the real world. Because this is not just a hearing room exercise. This has consequences. Real ones. When a government labels something as an existential threat, it reallocates attention, time, and resources. It tells the public, this matters more than everything else. It tells lawmakers, stop what you are doing. It tells agencies, prioritize this above all. And here is the contrast that Himes is forcing into the open. On one side, you have the claim, democracy is under threat from non-citizen voting. On the other side, you have the record, 77 cases in nearly a quarter century. On one side, you have urgency, halt the Senate, pass the bill, act immediately. On the other side, you have uncertainty, no clear numbers, no named intelligence, no documented surge. On one side, you have action, seizing machines, drafting legislation, mobilizing political will. On the other side, you have explanation. We are looking. We are assessing. We are continuing. That gap is not accidental. That gap is the story. Because once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The system is behaving as if the threat is massive, while the evidence behaves as if the threat is minimal. And those two realities cannot both be true at the same time. So now the question changes. It is no longer, is there fraud? It is no longer, are there vulnerabilities? It becomes something far more uncomfortable. If the evidence is not driving the reaction, then what is? And this is where the hearing stops being about institutions and becomes about people. Because behind every abstract phrase, election integrity, national security, existential threat, there is a real-world consequence, not for the officials sitting at that table, not for the agencies issuing carefully worded statements, for the public, for voters, for the system that only works if people believe it is grounded in truth. Think about what was actually built inside that room. A claim large enough to stop the Senate. A threat serious enough to justify federal seizure of voting machines. A narrative strong enough to dominate the national conversation. And yet, no number from the FBI. No named foreign actor from the intelligence community. No mention in official threat assessments. 77 cases in 24 years. That is not a disagreement. That is a disconnect. Now bring this down to a level everyone understands. If a company told its employees the building was on fire, shut down operations, evacuated the floors, halted production, and then, when asked where the fire was, could not point to smoke, could not show heat, could not identify a source, you would not call that caution. You would call that something else. You would start asking whether the alarm was pulled for a reason unrelated to the fire itself. That is the moral center of this moment. Because what Jim Himes exposed was not just a weak answer. It was a pattern of escalation without substantiation. Actions taken first. Justifications assembled afterward. Language used to fill gaps where evidence should be. And when that pattern reaches the level of national policy, when it begins to shape laws, redirect attention, and define threats, it stops being a technical issue. It becomes an ethical one. Who pays the price when the scale of a threat is overstated? It is not the official who gives the answer. It is not the agency that drafts the memo. It is a voter who begins to doubt the system. It is a citizen who is told their election may not be legitimate. It is a country that starts to operate on suspicion instead of proof. Because trust is not an abstract concept. It is a function. It either holds or it breaks. And once it breaks, it does not come back easily. Every exaggerated claim, every unsupported assertion, every moment where evidence is replaced with implication, it chips away at that foundation. And that is why this matters beyond politics. This is not about left versus right. This is not about one party winning an argument. This is about whether the most powerful institutions in the country are willing to align their actions with their evidence, or whether they are willing to let the size of a claim outrun the facts that are supposed to support it. Because once that line is crossed, it doesn't stop at elections. It becomes a method. You don't need proof, you need repetition. You don't need data, you need urgency. You don't need confirmation, you need the appearance of concern. And if that becomes normal, then the system is no longer anchored to reality. It is anchored to narrative. So here is the question that this hearing leaves behind, one that no official in that room fully answered. If a threat is big enough to stop a government, shouldn't the evidence be big enough to see? And if it isn't, then what exactly are we being asked to accept? Because at some point, silence dressed as language stops being neutral. It becomes a signal that the answer, if spoken plainly, would not support the action being taken. And that is where the responsibility shifts. To the audience, to the voters, to anyone watching this unfold. Look at what was said. Look harder at what was not said. Measure the claim against the evidence. And decide for yourself whether they match. If you believe conversations like this matter, if you believe evidence should come before action, not after, then don't just watch and move on. Like the video, share it with someone who needs to see it. Drop your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more breakdowns that don't just repeat the headlines, but actually test them.